August 15th, 1967, Rach Bang River in Xuyen Province, South Vietnam. The Bailey Bridge was rated for 43 tons. That number sat on every piece of paperwork stamped and filed, a neat, confident assurance in black ink. On paper, the structure was sound. In steel and bolts and muddy riverbank soil, it was a bet. That evening, the United States Army placed 61 tons of moving vehicles on a bridge designed for 43. The air was heavy and wet. The river moved slow on the surface and fast underneath, brown water sliding past the concrete piers with a deceptive calm. On the east bank, 23-year-old Captain James Theodore Mitchell, United States Army Corps of Engineers, stood with a clipboard in his hand and sweat soaking through the back of his uniform shirt. He watched the line of vehicles creep across the bridge at 1940 hours, one deuce-and-a-half truck after another, one Jeep, one flatbed, and in the middle of the sequence, painted in fading civilian colors instead of olive drab, bus number 12. Bus number 12 carried 34 South Vietnamese civilians, women, old men, and children evacuated from a village 8 kilometers north, their village now a burned smear on someone's operations map. They sat on hard benches in the dim interior, pressed shoulder to shoulder, clutching bags and chickens and metal lunch tins, eyes fixed on the open windows. The bus had no armor, it had no radio. It had a driver who had crossed this bridge dozens of times and who trusted that the steel beneath his wheels was solid because an American engineer had said so. At 1943 hours, the center span failed. The failure did not begin with a dramatic explosion. It began with a sound that almost no one heard, a sharp metallic report lost under engine noise and shouted instructions. One of the main connections at the center panel joint sheared under combined load. The bridge deck dipped by less than 2 inches in a fraction of a second. That slight drop shifted weight forward onto the already overstressed middle section. One rivet popped, then another. A weld that had passed visual inspection but hid a hairline flaw inside its gleaming bead reached its limit and fractured. The bridge did not collapse all at once. It sagged first, a slow, sick motion as the center of the span bowed toward the river. The bus driver felt the road tilt under his tires. He pumped the brake pedal out of instinct. The weight transfer slammed the front axle down onto steel that was no longer supported. Beneath him, a panel connection tore free with a scream of metal. The center span dropped. Bus number 12 tipped nose first into the river. The front end went over so quickly that most of the passengers did not even have time to cry out. The vehicle fell from bridge deck to water in less than 1 second. It struck the surface at roughly 37 miles per hour. The front windshield shattered inward in a spray of glass. Brown river water punched through the opening like a solid object and filled the cabin in 9 seconds. Inside the bus, the orderly rows of seated bodies became a thrashing tangle of limbs and clothing. The first breath everyone tried to take drew in water instead of air. Some passengers were hurled forward by the impact and pinned against seats and each other. Others clung to anything their hands could find, feeling surfaces vanish beneath their fingers as the bus rolled. Those closest to the broken windshield took the river full in the face. The force dislocated jaws, cracked ribs, and drove shards of glass into skin. The water was not cold enough to shock the heart into stopping. It was 31 degrees Fahrenheit in the deeper layers, just enough to steal breath and strength with ruthless efficiency. Outside, the vehicles behind the bus slammed on their brakes. A truck fishtailed on the steel decking. The Jeep at the rear skidded sideways and came to a stop with its front wheels hanging over empty space. Men shouted without words, voices flattened into raw noise. The partially collapsed span groaned under the weight of 3 trucks and 1 Jeep now perched on a twisted platform of bent metal 40 feet above the churning river. On the east bank, Captain James Mitchell saw the bus vanish. One instant it was there, awkward and civilian among the olive drab shapes. The next instant, it was gone, replaced by a jagged gap and a plume of water. His brain refused to accept the empty space where the vehicle had been. For 2 heartbeats, he stood frozen. Then he ran. He ran toward the noise, toward the buckling bridge deck, toward the spray of broken concrete and dust. The smell hit him first, a sharp reek of diesel fuel ripping free from ruptured tanks and spreading across the river surface like an oil slick. Underneath that was something else. The heavy, organic stench of wet earth ripped open, and already, faintly, the copper edge of blood. By the time he reached the near end of the damaged span, the bus had disappeared beneath the surface. The only sign of its passing was a widening circle of disturbed water and a few objects bobbing in the current: a metal food tin, a sandal, a small stuffed animal with one ear torn off. Then bodies began to surface. The river did not give them back gently. It rolled them, spun them, dragged them under again, then spat them into eddies along the banks. Some flailed weakly, coughing and retching, trying to keep their faces above the surface. Others floated limp, arms spread, hair fanned out around pale faces in the brown water. One child's hand broke the surface, reaching for something that was not there, then slipped under for the last time. Rescue efforts started almost instantly, but the river did not care about human urgency. Soldiers scrambled for ropes, for life vests, for any boat with an engine that would start. The first small craft churned out into the channel less than 3 minutes after the collapse. The captain of that boat later remembered seeing Captain Mitchell on the bank, standing still with a coil of rope in his hands, his eyes fixed on a point in the water where nothing remained. In the chaos of those first minutes, no one had the luxury of counting. Later, they would count. They would study after-action reports, casualty lists, hospital records. They would write numbers in columns and add them, then check the sums again. They would determine that 28 passengers from bus number 12 drowned before rescue crews could reach them. 6 more died in the hospital within 48 hours from crush injuries, internal bleeding, and pneumonia, triggered by aspirated river water. That night, Captain Mitchell did not sleep. He did not lie down. He gave statements. He answered questions from shaken officers whose own signatures appeared on earlier approval forms. He walked the remaining intact sections of the bridge with a flashlight in his hand, shining the beam into every joint and panel as if he might find a single failed rivet that could explain everything. The light bounced off intact steel and showed him nothing that made sense. In the early hours of the morning, when the generators ran low and the camp fell into an exhausted silence, broken only by distant artillery, like a storm over the horizon, Mitchell finally sat down alone at a field desk under a canvas awning. Someone had left a pad of yellow legal paper and a ballpoint pen there. He began to write numbers. He wrote the rated capacity of the bridge, 43 tons. He wrote the approximated combined weight of the vehicles that had been on the span at the moment of failure, 61 tons. He wrote the dimensions of the center panel. He wrote the calculated stress on the main connections. He wrote the steel grade specified in the contract. He wrote the steel grade actually delivered as best he could infer from procurement notes and shipping crates already burned for firewood. He wrote the number of days the structure had been in service. He wrote the number of dead. He filled one page with figures, then another. The numbers marched down the paper in neat columns, separated by lines and symbols, forming equations that had seemed reassuring in training classrooms and design offices. Out here, by the light of a single flickering bulb, they looked like accusations. He tried to find a single point of failure he could circle, an obvious miscalculation, a load he had not accounted for, an unambiguous mistake with his name on it. Instead, he found margins shaved here and there, a safety factor trimmed by a logistics officer desperate to move supplies faster, a substitution of locally procured steel for what the original design had assumed, a field modification that added weight but had never been entered into the formal documentation. Individually, each deviation had been small. Together, under 61 tons of moving vehicles on a humid August evening, they had been enough to turn a bridge into a trap. The numbers did not forgive him. They arranged themselves in his mind into a different shape, not equations now, but a list that could never be erased. At the top of that list sat his own signature on the inspection report, confirming that the structure was safe for traffic. In the following week, he reviewed every photograph taken of the collapsed span, grainy images of twisted steel, of a bus winched from the river, its windows punched out, mud and weeds hanging from its broken frame. He walked the site again and again until the mud recorded his boot prints on top of themselves in a palimpsest of guilt. He read engineering manuals by lantern light, as if the answer might be hidden in a paragraph he had skimmed over years before. Sleep, when it came, brought no rest. Night after night, he dreamed of the river. In some dreams, the bus fell in slow motion, descending through the air so gradually that he had time to reach it, to run across the sagging deck and grab the bumper and hold it up with his bare hands. In those dreams, the metal tore his fingers open, but the vehicle did not fall. Then the scene would shift, and he would be standing waist-deep in the river as bodies drifted past him one by one, each face turning toward him as it passed, eyes open and unblinking. In other dreams, there was no bus. There was only the bridge itself, a skeletal structure made of numbers instead of steel, each beam labeled with a figure from his calculations. When the span collapsed in those dreams, it was not metal that broke, but digits, shattering into fragments that rained down around him like sharp glass. He would wake with his heart racing and the taste of diesel and muddy water in his mouth. The Army did what armies do. It convened an investigation. Committees of officers and civilian engineers sifted through reports and photographs. They questioned witnesses. They traced the path of every component from factory to riverbank. They concluded that the primary causes were material substitution and overloading beyond the original rating. They noted that the young captain on site had flagged concerns about the increasing traffic load in a memo that had not been properly acted upon. They filed their findings. They recommended procedural changes. None of that altered the fact that 28 civilians had drowned in 9 seconds after trusting a structure that bore his approval. None of that changed the simple, brutal memory of standing on a riverbank and watching bodies float by. 2 years and change later, in the spring of 1969, Captain James Mitchell was no longer at a muddy river in Vietnam. He was at Fort Benning, Georgia, standing in a clean classroom with a chalkboard behind him and rows of young engineer officers in front of him. The Army had promoted him to major. It had pinned a bronze star on his chest for actions under fire during the Tet Offensive. It had assigned him to teach field fortifications and temporary bridging. He spoke to the lieutenants about load calculations and safety factors. He spoke about soil conditions and current speed, and the deceptive strength of sun-baked riverbanks that turned to soup under sustained rain. He spoke about the difference between what a structure could carry once and what it had to carry every day for months. The students took notes, some diligently, some out of habit. None of them had stood on a riverbank watching a bus disappear. When he spoke about bridge failures, he did not mention Rach Bang by name. He used abstract examples, schematic diagrams, anonymized case studies. But in his own head, there was nothing abstract about it. Every time he chalked a number on the board, he saw the yellow legal pages he had filled that night, the ink smeared where his hand had rested too long on one particular sum. In the privacy of his small on-post quarters, he developed rituals. Before signing off on any training exercise plan that involved a temporary structure, he would check every load calculation himself, even when a competent lieutenant had already done the math. He would call the supply depot to confirm materials, then call again and insist on serial numbers. He would walk every weld personally. He would run a hand over each panel joint as if he could feel hidden flaws through the surface. The time this consumed made him unpopular with some, but the structures he oversaw never failed. He told himself that this obsession was simply professionalism sharpened by experience. In truth, it was a promise, made in the dark on a riverbank and written on yellow paper beside a lantern that hummed and flickered. No structure would leave his hands again unless he was willing to bet his own life on it. In April of 1971, the Army informed Major James Mitchell that his time in the classroom was over. He received orders assigning him back to Vietnam, this time as operations officer for an engineer battalion supporting an infantry division in Quang Tri Province. The war had changed in the years since he had last been in country. The names of battles were different. The enemy had adapted. The politics were uglier. The rivers, however, were the same. The bridges, temporary or permanent, still represented the same cold equation: weight, span, time, and risk. A little after 03:15 hours on April 17, 1971, in a plywood tactical operations center lit by a single bare bulb, a radio handset crackled in his hand, and a voice on the other end told him that 300 men were trapped on the wrong side of a river and that dawn was coming. The voice asked him a question: Could he build a bridge in 6 hours across a 60-meter current where doctrine and manuals and his own classroom lectures all agreed that 12 hours was the minimum? He looked down at the map spread in front of him. His gaze rested on the blue line of the river, on the contour lines of the banks, on the numerical scale in the corner. He closed his eyes and for a heartbeat saw not the printed grid, but the brown face of the Raich Bang River, the bus sliding under the widening circle of disturbed water. In that instant, two sets of numbers collided in his mind, the old list written in desperation on yellow paper and the new requirements forming in front of him on the map table. Then he opened his eyes and gave an answer. The voice on the radio belonged to Colonel Thomas Greer, commanding officer of the 1st Battalion, 9th Infantry, a man known for never raising his voice in the middle of gunfire, and now that calm was gone. Static chewed at the edges of his words, but the numbers came through clearly. 300 men on the West Bank. No usable crossing within 12 kilometers. Enemy contact closing from the north. Dawn in 5 hours and 40 minutes. Without a bridge, the battalion would be pinned against the river at first light. Major James Mitchell listened with the handset pressed tight against his ear in the plywood operation shack, rain hammering the tin roof overhead like machine gun fire. On the table in front of him, a map of Quang Tri Province lay under the yellow glare of a single bare bulb, the river drawn as a thin blue line that looked harmless and abstract. He asked the question anyway, because procedure demanded it. "What about air?" Greer answered in a flat rasp. "Low clouds, no ceiling, no visual. Helicopters grounded 40 minutes ago. No gunships, no lifts, no resupply." The sky was gone. The only direction left was across. Mitchell's eyes traced the blue line west of the battalion's marker. The river was labeled with a name he had not bothered to learn yet. Just another obstacle drawn in ink, 60 meters wide according to the last survey. The file on the shelf said depth at center channel 17 feet in the dry season, current speed 4 knots, clay banks over bedrock. The file did not say what weeks of monsoon rain would do to that clay, or how far the water level would climb, or how much debris the current would carry in its teeth. It certainly did not say whether that river was the kind that took things and gave them back, or the kind that kept them. He asked for the original crossing plan. A lieutenant at the far end of the room flipped through folders with shaking hands and found the sheet. A simple infantry footbridge upstream on a narrower section with an approach road cut into the far bank. It was gone now, Greer explained in brief, clipped phrases. The last 2 days of rain had turned the far landing zone into a pit of knee-deep slurry. 3 trucks had already sunk to their axles trying to claw their way out. The river had taken the road the way it took everything eventually. The infantry had pushed forward on foot. Now they were boxed in by a widening pocket of enemy pressure and a river that had grown twice as wide as the old measurements. Mitchell asked for numbers. It was the only thing that felt solid. Available engineers, available equipment, available time. Captain Rodriguez, his operations officer, answered from memory and then from paper. Alpha Company engineers, 42 men on standby. Bravo Company, 38 men due back from a road clearance mission in 90 minutes, if the roads held. Headquarters platoon, 16 more that could be stripped from rear security if they were willing to accept that risk. A total of 96 men if every truck made it back through the mud and no one took a round on the way. Equipment. 2 complete sets of modular bridge panels, enough steel to span 60 meters with margin to spare, stacked on flatbeds in a depot 3 kilometers south. 1 crane truck, operational, 2 winch trucks, 1 sound, 1 bleeding hydraulic fluid, and waiting on parts. Generators, welding sets, cutting torches, cable, chain, fasteners. On paper, it was everything a manual would list under sufficient resources. Manuals did not list fatigue, fear, mud that sucked at boots to the ankle, or the way hands slipped on wet steel at 3 in the morning. Mitchell did the arithmetic by habit and by reflex. A 60-meter span meant at least 5 standard Bailey panels aligned end to end, possibly 6 depending on the water's true width under flood. Each panel weighed just over a ton. 8 men to move it, more to pin it, more to weld it. He knew the training numbers by heart. Under ideal conditions with daylight, stable banks, and no incoming fire, a company of engineers could erect that bridge in 12 hours. The manuals were blunt on that point. 12 hours was not a recommendation. It was the bottom edge of the safe window. Greer did not ask about manuals. He asked a different question, low and fierce through the static. Could it be done in 6 hours? Could they put steel over that water before first light? Could they pull 300 men and 40 trucks and half a battalion's ammunition across that improvised spine before the enemy reached them at dawn? There was no accusation in his voice, only the flat iron weight of necessity. Mitchell did not answer immediately. He set the handset down on the table and looked at the map. The blue line of the river blurred in his vision and became another river for a heartbeat, brown and slow on the surface, with a bus tipping headfirst into it. He smelled diesel and wet mud and heard the muffled, echoing thump of a vehicle hitting water at 37 miles per hour. He saw 34 faces reflected in the black glass of the river, then disappearing as if the water had simply closed over a flaw in the world. He forced his eyes to focus on the ink again. He asked himself a question that no manual could phrase. Was it more dangerous to build a bridge in 6 hours instead of 12, or to leave 300 men on the wrong side of the river with nowhere to go when the enemy found them? One kind of risk wrote its numbers on paper. The other wrote them in blood. He remembered yellow legal paper under a lantern, a list of dead that did not care whether the math had been technically correct. He picked up the handset and said the only thing that left a path forward. The bridge would be there before dawn. He heard his own voice and did not entirely recognize it. It sounded calm, almost bored, as if he were reading out a weather report instead of promising to compress 12 hours of careful work into 6 hours of darkness. Greer accepted the answer without comment. The line went dead. The silence that followed felt heavier than the rain. The room watched him. Rodriguez, the young lieutenants, the sergeant at the radio. They were all waiting for an explanation he did not intend to give. He did not tell them that it was impossible. He did not tell them that the manuals were not suggestions. He did not tell them that he could still feel river water in his lungs some nights when he woke up from dreams. He simply began assigning tasks. Alpha Company to the bridge site immediately for site preparation. Clear both banks. Cut access down to solid soil. Mark potential anchor points on both sides. Set floodlights, but shield them from the far bank to avoid painting a perfect target for any enemy with mortars. Headquarters platoon to strip the depot of every panel, every bolt, every length of chain. 2 trucks for panels, 1 for tools, 1 for generators and fuel. Bravo Company, the moment they rolled into camp, would not even dismount. They would turn north and drive straight for the river. The operation shack emptied in less than a minute. Boots pounded on plywood. Engines coughed awake in the rain outside and then roared into life. Through the open door, he saw trucks lurching forward, silhouettes of men throwing themselves onto tailgates, shapes moving with the desperation of people who understood that the only way to survive the next 6 hours was to make someone else's impossible promise come true. Mitchell stayed just long enough to scratch a sequence of times onto a pad. Not elegant calculations now, just a brutal list. 0400 hours, convoy departs depot. 0518. Arrival at river, if the road holds. 0630. Minimum span must be in place. 0650. First vehicle crossing. 0730. Last man across. Each line was what would have been a conservative guess, in daylight, halved, and then shaved again. There was no room left for error. There was not even room for bad luck. He rode in the lead Jeep with Specialist Kowalski, the vehicle rattling over ruts and through pools of mud that splashed up into the open cabin. The night outside was thick and close. They drove without headlights, guided by a faint smear of lighter gray on the horizon and the occasional pulse of distant artillery flickering on the undersides of the clouds. Every few hundred yards, the Jeep lurched to one side as the wheels slid in the slick clay. Kowalski corrected each skid with sharp, practice movements. Behind them, in the darkness, 10 heavy trucks followed at distances that were more guess than measurement, each one carrying several tons of steel that would either save 300 men or drag more names into the water. Twice the convoy had to stop, once for a fallen tree, already half rotted but still heavy enough that 4 men had to put their shoulders under it to roll it into the ditch. once for a stretch of road where a runoff channel had eaten away one side of the embankment. The lead truck's wheel slipped off the edge, leaving the vehicle tilted at a sickening angle over a drop of 8 feet to a ravine. The driver sat rigid at the wheel, hands frozen. The rest of the engineers swarmed around the truck like ants, shoving rocks and sandbags under the wheels, chaining the frame to the Jeep as an anchor. For a full minute, the vehicle hung in balance, 12 tons of steel and cargo on the edge of sliding into a place where it could not be retrieved, where every panel on its back would become useless weight buried in mud. In the end, the tires found purchase and the truck lurched forward. It cost them 6 minutes. Mitchell felt each of those minutes settle on his shoulders like extra weight. They reached the river at 18 minutes past 5. The site did not look like the neat sketches in the field manuals. It looked like the edge of the world. The water was wider than the map had promised, the far bank farther away, the current a dark, moving skin over something that tugged and pulled and whispered. Floodlights on tripods lit the near bank in harsh white, turning the rain into a curtain of silver spears. Beyond the glare, the river itself was a flat, black strip flecked with white where debris caught the light. Logs, branches, something that might have been an animal carcass and might have been something else. Alpha Company was already there. They had hacked down brush with machetes, driven wooden stakes into the bank to mark out the approach, and carved a crude sloping ramp down to the water. The clay under Mitchell's boots felt slick, but firm. The men on the far bank, who had come over in a small aluminum boat that sat now half full of water and mud, were silhouettes against a second bank of floodlights. Their shouts came thin and distorted over the water. The crane truck pulled into position 25 meters back from the edge. Its engine idled with a low, steady growl. Warrant Officer Chen, round-faced and expressionless, climbed into the cab and began to extend the boom. The first panel came off the flatbed in a shriek of metal on metal as the chains went taut. 8 men guided it into the air with taglines, boots slipping in the mud, shoulders hunched against the rain that made everything slick. The panel swung out over the riverbank, a rectangle of steel silhouetted against nothing. They set the first section onto the prepared supports at the near bank. It had to be exact. If the base was crooked by even an inch, every panel that followed would compound that error until the far end of the bridge hung in the air like a misaligned jaw. Men dropped to their knees on the wet deck, slamming bolts through pre-drilled holes with gloved hands, tightening nuts with wrenches until the metal sang. Sparks burst where welders sealed connection plates, the white light so bright it stung eyes through closed lids. The second panel rose into the air on the crane's hook. Out over the water now, 30 feet from the bank, the wind caught its surface and made it sway. The 8 men on the lines leaned their full weight against it, soaked uniforms plastered to their backs, boots grinding small trenches into the mud. For a moment the panel hung crooked, one corner dipping lower than the others. A shout went up from 3 throats at once. Hands shifted, the rectangle steadied. Chen eased the boom forward millimeter by millimeter. The male and female ends of the panels kissed with a hollow metallic clunk. Bolts slid through. The bridge grew by another 13 meters. Mitchell walked the newborn structure the moment the welders cleared it, boots thudding on the steel, feeling the slight movement under his weight. The river slid by beneath the open lattice, close enough that drops of spray reached his face. He knelt at the center joint and ran his fingers along the weld, feeling for any sign of slag, a crater, a cold lap, an imperfection that would turn into a fracture under load. The bead looked clean, but his fingers remembered another night, another weld, and the sickening sensation of metal letting go. For a heartbeat, he saw not dark water below, but the white roof of a bus turning slowly, then disappearing. He blinked and the river came back, the weld held under his hand. For now. The third panel swung out. The operation repeated with the speed that came from muscle memory, beaten into men who had done this in training 100 times, but never with this much on the line. The bridge reached 26 meters, then 39. The far bank was no longer an abstract opposite shore. It was a strip of mud and clay with human figures on it, close enough for Mitchell to see the lines of strain on their faces in the floodlight glare. Then on the fourth panel, the river tried to reclaim its due. The panel rose cleanly at first. Then, as Chen extended the boom, something in the crane's guts let out a long, high hiss, like a snake under pressure. The boom jerked, dipped, and the 75mm lifting cable went slack for a heartbeat before snapping taut again with a sound like a gunshot. The panel swung wild, its far end dropping toward the water. The 8 men on the guidelines were yanked forward as if hooked to a runaway train. 2 of them lost their footing and slid toward the edge of the bank, boots scrabbling furrows in the mud. Rodriguez moved before he could think. He dropped his clipboard, sprinted the 3 paces to the nearest guideline, and seized it with both hands just as it began to slip through the palms of a corporal who had already burned through his gloves. The friction tore into his own bare skin instantly. The rope tried to rip itself out of his grasp, the weight of a full ton of steel at the other end using his fingers as a brake. Pain flared white-hot in his arms. The world narrowed to the line in his hands and the panel above the water. Mitchell shouted at him to let go. The words tore his throat on the way out. Rodriguez did not answer. His jaw clenched, teeth bared. He planted his heels in the mud and leaned back with every muscle in his body, tendons standing out in his neck. The line cut through the skin of his palms and bit into meat. Blood mixed with rain and ran down his wrists. For a heartbeat, the panel paused in its fall, hanging at an angle over the black water, 1 corner inches above the surface. Chen, eyes wide in the crane cab, slammed the emergency stop and fought the failing hydraulics, coaxing enough pressure out of the wounded system to take some of the weight. The maintenance team was already scrambling under the crane, hands groping for the leaking line in the forest of metal and hose. One of them found it by feel and by the warmth of escaping fluid on his fingertips. A loose fitting on the manifold, vibrating itself free after years of service. He barked a single word, and someone shoved a wrench into his hand. He tightened the fitting in the dark, working blind, trusting touch and the sound of threads grinding home. Rodriguez's grip failed exactly 1 second after the fitting seated. The crane took the load again, just as his skin finally surrendered. The line burned out of his hands, leaving strips of torn flesh clinging to the fibers. He fell backward into the mud, arms limp, palms a ruin of raw red and white. The panel swung, still heavy, but now under control, and then lowered, shuddering, into place against the waiting end of the 3rd section. For a moment, no one moved. Rain hissed on steel. The river murmured. The raw sound of Rodriguez breathing in ragged gasps filled the space between heartbeats. Then the spell broke. Medics ran to him with bandages already unrolled. He yanked his hands away from them with a sharp, guttural sound and staggered to his feet. His fingers would not close. Blood dripped from them in steady drops. He looked at the bridge, at the hanging panel now resting on its supports, and only then allowed the medic to wrap his hands in white like a boxer's. Mitchell walked to him. The words, "Stand down," already formed in his mind. One look at Rodriguez's face stopped them in his throat. There was no space in that expression for anything but stubborn, furious purpose. Mitchell said nothing. He only nodded toward the river. Rodriguez nodded back and turned to the next task, barking hoarse orders through teeth that chattered not from cold, but from the aftershocks of pain. The bridge reached 52 meters at 6:37. One more panel closed the gap. The far bank received the nose of the structure with something like relief. Engineers there surging forward to seize it, bolt it down, weld it to a frame already half buried in the clay. A continuous span now connected one bank to the other, 62 meters of steel and sweat and blood and frayed hydraulic lines. Completion did not mean safety. Completion only meant the river had something new to test. Mitchell cleared the bridge with a single sweep of his arm. Everyone off except the inspection team. He stepped onto the deck and walked from one shore to the other. The floodlights threw his shadow under his boots, a long, dark shape stretching over moving water. At each joint, he knelt, ignoring the way his knees sank into cold puddles. He touched every weld, fingers running along the beads like a blind man reading a script that could only say, hold or break. At the center joint where panel 3 met panel 4, he lingered a heartbeat longer. The weld there was thicker, hastier, laid down in the seconds after the near failure. The metal under his fingers was still warm. He closed his eyes, just for that one joint. Behind his eyelids, the river changed again. It narrowed. The floodlights dimmed and became lanterns on poles. The steel under his hands became painted concrete. He heard the scream of tearing metal and the bone-deep thump of a bus hitting water. He saw small hands on glass. He opened his eyes before the bus could disappear and forced his focus back into the present. The weld was not perfect. Nothing built this fast could be perfect. But it held. For now, it held. At 6:51, he gave the order. The bridge was open. Light vehicles first, one at a time. No exceptions. A Jeep rolled forward out of the darkness, its driver hunched over the wheel, knuckles white on the rim. The front tires bumped onto the deck. The suspension flexed. Every head turned to watch as it crept toward the center. When it reached the midpoint, right above the warm weld, the bridge dipped half an inch. The sound it made was not a groan or a crack. It was a low, resonant hum, the voice of steel remembering what it was made to do. The Jeep reached the far side, then another, then the first truck, a 2.5-ton cargo vehicle heavy with ammunition and rations. The driver stopped at the edge of the deck and stared straight ahead for 3 long breaths. Then he eased onto the bridge. Midspan, the structure sagged a full inch under the additional load. The side rails shivered. Somewhere deep in the skeleton, a chain creaked like a ship under sail. The truck rolled off onto the far bank, and the bridge sprang back a fraction. The crossing turned into a slow procession. Men on foot, jeeps, trucks, always one at a time on the span, each separated by 10 meters of empty steel. The line of bodies and vehicles on the west bank shrank, but not fast enough for the sky. The black above them was already going thin at the edges. A lighter gray seeped into the clouds in the east, the earliest hint of dawn. The enemy did not need full daylight. They needed enough light to see silhouettes against the river and the bright straight line of a bridge. Mitchell stood at the entrance, counting under his breath, tracking each man and vehicle as if his will alone could push them faster. 20 trucks across, 40, 130 men, 180. The numbers stacked in his mind alongside older numbers. 28 drowned in 9 seconds, 6 more in the hospital, 34 total. 28 plus 6 plus 300. The math had never stopped. At 23 minutes past 7, with the sky a smudge of dirty pearl instead of black, the last truck rolled onto the deck from the west bank. It was heavier than it should have been, overloaded in the way drivers always overloaded just this once when they believed the structure could take it. Ammunition, fuel, spare parts. Everything a battalion needed to keep moving. The truck's front tires hit the bridge, and the entire span gave a subtle, almost graceful dip, like a man taking a breath before stepping into deep water. Mitchell heard the first wrong sound before he saw the source. It was small at first, almost polite, a high, dry tick from somewhere near the center of the span. Then another, sharper, like a hammer striking a chisel. His eyes snapped to the middle of the bridge, to the joint between panel 3 and panel 4, to the weld whose warmth he had felt under his fingertips. A thin, pale line appeared along the length of the bead. For a heartbeat, it was no more than a hairline, a change in texture on the surface. Then, with the truck's weight bearing down, the line widened. Metal that had been one piece a moment before separated into 2 bright edges, raw and shining against the darker steel around them. The crack ran like a lightning bolt along the seam, straight and merciless. He saw it open. He felt the bridge shift under the new geometry of stress. The river, patient and heavy, waited 20 feet below. The crack did not roar. It whispered, a thin, dry sound beneath the grind of the truck's gears and the hush of the river, the kind of noise only a man who had watched metal fail before would notice in time. Major James Mitchell heard it because some part of him had been listening for it since the night a different structure tore itself apart and took 34 lives with it. His mind did not have to translate what his eyes saw next. The clean, curved bead of weld at the center joint split open, and the 2 bright edges of raw steel showed through like exposed bone. For one suspended heartbeat, everything held. The truck's front axle sat almost exactly over the failing seam. The driver, a sergeant from Bravo Company whose name Mitchell would read later in a list he could not forget, stared straight ahead, unaware that the path under him had turned into a question. The bridge sagged a fraction more, slipping past the line between elastic and permanent deformation. Somewhere deep in the frame, a support pin shrieked in protest. The river waited below, moving with the same indifferent patience it had shown every day for centuries. Then the crack ran. It did not creep. It shot along the joint in a straight, merciless line, racing the length of the connection where panel 3 met panel 4. What had been one piece became 2, joined now only by friction and habit. The deck under the truck dropped an inch, then 2. The movement rippled through the span like a wave. Men on the far bank grabbed for support as the railing jerked under their hands. On the near bank, engineers flinched as if the bridge were a living thing that had just cried out. Mitchell moved before his conscious mind caught up. His throat had already shaped a command before his brain chose the words. He shouted for the driver to get out, to abandon the vehicle, to run. The sound of his own voice startled him, raw and breaking. Nothing like the steady tone he had used on the radio earlier. The sergeant in the truck cab turned his head just enough for his eyes to meet Mitchell's. For the briefest moment, Mitchell did not see a stranger in a helmet. He saw the bus driver from Raich Bang, a man whose face he had only glimpsed once through glass, looking back in confusion as the world tilted under him. The truck's windshield framed this new face in almost the same way. Rain streaked the glass. The river murmured below. The structure trembled. The driver's hand went for the door handle. The movement shifted his weight. The front of the truck lurched down another inch as the compromised joint yielded. Steel grated on steel. The deck under the right front tire twisted, its supporting beam no longer properly braced. If the truck went with it, it would drag the already weakened panels into a cascade of failure. The entire midsection of the bridge could peel away and fold into the river, taking men, vehicles, and the last 6 hours of desperate work with it. Mitchell understood that in a single, brutal calculation that did not need pencil or paper. One truck, one man in its cab, 300 soldiers already across or halfway, dozens more waiting to cross. The truck was a weight on the wrong side of an equation that would not balance. For the second time in his life, he was watching a vehicle caught on a failing structure. This time, the variables were not civilians and bureaucracy. This time, they were his men, his bridge, his choices. He did something no manual had ever told him how to do. He ran out onto the bridge. The deck vibrated under his boots, a live wire humming with load and tension. Every instinct screamed at him to stay off the compromised structure, to get back, to let the physics finish what they had started, without adding his own 180 pounds to the wrong place. He ignored all of it. The distance from the bank to the midpoint had never felt so long. Rain whipped into his face. His boots slipped once on slick steel, sending his heart into his throat before he caught himself on the rail and pushed on. As he closed the gap, he saw more detail. The weld had not simply split down the middle. In some places, it had torn away chunks from the parent metal, leaving jagged, tooth-like projections. One of the main bolts had been almost 45 degrees. Its shank, under a stress it had never been designed to bear. The deck plates around the joint showed hairline fractures radiating out like cracks in glass from the point of initial failure. The bridge was not one step away from collapsing. It was half a step and a bad decision away. He reached the side of the truck and slammed his palm against the door. Inside, the driver had already unlatched his harness. His eyes were wide, not with panic yet, but with the clear, cold knowledge that something under him was wrong in a way that training did not cover. Mitchell did not waste time trying to explain loads or moments or structural redundancy. He pointed back to the near bank and shouted a single word, once, with all the authority he had left in him. Out. The driver obeyed. He swung his feet out of the cab and jumped down onto the deck. The instant his boots left the floor, the truck's suspension rose a fraction, shedding his slight weight like a shrug. Mitchell grabbed his sleeve and hauled him toward the bank, away from the center joint, away from the invisible fulcrum on which the entire span now balanced. Every step they took shifted the load distribution by a sliver, moving precious pounds off the failing seam. Behind them, on the far bank, someone started waving frantically, but Mitchell did not look back. He could not. Looking back would mean seeing the whole picture, and right now his world had shrunk to three things: the thick steel beam under his feet, the man whose arm he gripped hard enough to bruise, and the bright, widening line of broken weld a meter to his left. They made it 10 feet before the truck settled again. The front axle dropped that final half inch. The broken weld's two halves, no longer perfectly mated, ground past each other. The sound was not sharp. It was low and almost intimate, like a groan leaking out of a wounded animal that had finally realized it was dying. The deck under the truck sagged another degree. The vehicle's nose dipped toward the water. They were not going to get the truck off. Any further motion forward meant driving the damaged sections farther into failure, peeling up decking as it went. Any attempt to reverse risked shifting the load in exactly the wrong direction at exactly the wrong time. The structure did not need a full collapse to kill. Even a partial tear could snap the spine of the bridge, leaving a twisted, broken arc that no one could cross. Mitchell stopped pulling the driver. For a second, the younger man stumbled against him, expecting another tug. When it did not come, he turned. In that brief turn, in the way his mouth opened to ask something and then closed when he saw the look on Mitchell's face, there was an understanding that did not need words. The major let go of his sleeve. There was one thing heavier than a loaded truck on a failing bridge. A loaded truck on a failing bridge with its parking brake set. Mitchell stepped back toward the cab. Even in that moment, a detached corner of his mind cataloged the absurdity of it. The training films, the manuals, the thick-bound volumes that had explained how to calculate safe loads and design temporary trestles and estimate current drag had never included the scenario officer walks toward the point of imminent structural failure on purpose. They assumed that once failure began, men would either flee or fall. They did not account for the kind of stubborn refusal to surrender a single pound of unnecessary force to gravity. He gripped the door handle with knuckles gone white and hauled himself up into the cab. The interior smelled of oil and wet canvas and a faint, sour tang of fear. The steering wheel shuddered under his hand with every micro-movement of the deck. The gear shift, still in low, vibrated in place. He reached down, found the brake lever, and kicked it free with the heel of his boot. For a moment, nothing changed. Then, almost imperceptibly, the truck rolled forward 2 inches, its tires finding a slightly lower spot in the now distorted deck. The shift redistributed weight along the frame, taking some of the crushing force off the worst of the broken weld edges and spreading it to connections that were still whole. The deck flexed, then settled into a new equilibrium. It was not stable. It was survivable. He bailed out of the cab and hit the deck hard enough to send a bolt of pain up through his knees. The driver grabbed his arm again on instinct, as if to steady him, and together they half ran, half slid back toward the near bank. Under their boots, the vibration felt different now. Still wrong, but less catastrophic. The bridge was no longer on the immediate edge of giving way. It had stepped back from that ledge by the width of a tire's roll. On the near bank, Rodriguez stood with both hands bandaged into white mitts, stained through with pink where blood had already seeped. His face was gray under the mud streaks, lips pressed into a line that might have been pain or might have been fury. He had watched the entire scene with the truck from 10 meters away, unable to grip a rope, unable to grab a tool, able only to stand and bear witness. When Mitchell and the driver reached him, Rodriguez's eyes flicked once to the hairline gap that now ran the length of the center joint. The crack had stopped widening for the moment. Each time the bridge exhaled under a passing weight, the bright edges of the separated metal winked at them like the glint of teeth underwater. The damage was there, and it was not going away on its own. They had bought seconds, maybe minutes, not more. Mitchell's mind, still running in the parallel track it had occupied since he had heard Greer's voice on the radio, started to fill those seconds with tasks. Reinforcement, load shedding, reprioritization. The bridge could not be treated as whole anymore. It had a wound, and that wound had to be braced before it tore open the rest of the span. He barked orders without preamble. No more trucks over the center, light vehicles and men on foot only. Anyone waiting with a load over 2 tons would stand down until further notice. Grab chain, grab spare beams, grab anything that could act as an improvised splint under the broken joint. The words came out faster than his own ears could track, but the engineers around him did not need clarity. They needed direction, any direction that did not end with the sound of steel snapping and bodies hitting water. Rodriguez, hands useless for fine work, threw himself into motion anyway. He used his elbows and shoulders, his bandaged fists, his voice. He kicked chocks under wheels. He shoved men into place with the weight of his body. He leaned his whole frame against a length of reinforcing beam as others wrestled it into position under the sagging deck, turning his pain into leverage. Every time someone flinched at the sight of his ruined palms, he snapped at them to keep moving. Pain to him was something to step on, not something to carry. Under the bridge, the river did what rivers always do. It pulled, it pushed, it nosed against the pontoons and pilings, testing. The additional flex at the center joint changed the way the structure sat in the water. One of the support pontoons took more load than it had before. The bow of the floating support dug deeper into the current. If it slipped its moorings, or if the anchor chain snapped, the entire midsection could swing downstream like a gate, tearing free from its carefully placed landward anchors. Mitchell knew that too. As soon as the first reinforcing beam slammed into place under the cracked joint, he turned his attention to the lines leading down into the water. The anchors had been set in haste, but not carelessly. Heavy steel deadmen had been buried back from the bank, cables running from them over pulleys and down to the pontoons. Those cables now thrummed like plucked strings under the stress. One of them had picked up a new discordant note. The angle had shifted. The line bit into the soil at a steeper pitch. If the river had a voice, it would have been laughing. He grabbed a nearby sergeant and pointed at the cables. Extra anchors, double the lines. Sandbags over the dead men to keep the soil from shearing. If they could spread the load even a little, keep the floating supports from swinging, the cracked section might hold long enough to get the last men across. Might. The entire plan now rested on that uncertain word. Vehicles stacked up on the far bank, brakes squealing, drivers confused by the halt. The battalion across the river had been promised an escape route that would take them and their equipment out of a closing vise. Now the route existed, but had turned treacherous in the middle. Mitchell grabbed the radio handset from a corporal who had been clutching it like a lifeline and keyed the transmit switch. He did not give Colonel Greer a full report. There was no time for engineering language. He said the bridge was up, but damaged. He said men on foot could still cross and that he recommended they start doing that immediately. He said trucks would have to wait. The colonel did not argue. He did not have the luxury. Over the hiss of static, in the spaces between clipped acknowledgments, Mitchell could hear something else in the background of Greer's channel. Distant detonations, the staccato chatter of automatic fire. The war was not politely pausing for the engineers to patch their work. Infantry began to pour across the bridge in earnest now, moving at a trot that came just short of a run. Packs bounced. Weapons clattered against web gear. Boots hammered on steel. Each footfall sent a small vibration through the span, another reminder to the cracked joint that it was bearing more than it had been asked to carry an hour ago. The reinforcing beam under the brake took some of the load, but not all. It could not erase the damage. It could only redistribute the pain. Mitchell stood at the near bank and watched the faces go by, mud-streaked, eyes hollowed out by too many nights like this. Some glanced down as they passed the center, taking in the gap along the Weld, the bright new scar running across the deck's spine. Others kept their eyes locked straight ahead, refusing to see the drop beneath their boots. A few recognized him from previous operations and gave the smallest of nods as they passed, as if to say, if the bridge holds, it will be because of you, and if it does not, we know whose ghost to haunt. Every few dozen men, the flow would stutter as someone's courage snagged on the sight of open water glimpsed through the deck lattice. A hand would grip the rail too tight. A boot would hesitate mid-step. The crowd behind would bunch up, pressure building like water at a narrowing in a river. Rodriguez, whose voice carried even when the rest of him shook, positioned himself just short of the center with his bandaged fists on his hips. He became a human breakwater, snapping men out of their freeze with snapped words and the sheer indignation of someone who had already bled for this structure and would not tolerate anyone wasting the time bought at that price. The sky continued to lighten, a slow, pitiless gradient from ink to ash. Shapes on the far tree line began to emerge from the gloom. What had been a flat black line became individual tree trunks, then the faint suggestion of movement between them. Somewhere out there, men with rifles and mortars and their own deadlines were watching a man-made line of steel defy the river for one more hour than it should have. On the near bank, with each passing minute, the numbers in Mitchell's head crept closer to zero. Men remaining to cross. Vehicles still stranded. Minutes until there was enough light for a decent rifleman to pick off silhouettes on the open deck. Seconds until the next small warning sound from the wounded joint that would tell him their borrowed time had run out. He could feel the bridge's heartbeat now in the soles of his feet and the bones of his legs. Every thump of boots, every creak of chain, every sigh of stressed steel blended into a rhythm that matched the one pounding in his chest. It was not a steady rhythm. It stuttered, sped, stumbled, recovered. It was the beat of something running while wounded. The last platoon of infantry from Greer's battalion reached the near bank at last. Faces that had been mere figures on a map hours ago now passed within arm's length, their owners shooting glances back over their shoulders at the far side they were leaving behind. The far bank itself was a churned mess of mud and tracks and abandoned equipment now. A few trucks still waited there, engines idling, exhaust smoke hanging low and heavy in the damp air. They were not just machines. They were ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, food. Leaving them would cost lives later, in other fights. Mitchell knew it. Greer knew it. The men watching from both sides knew it. The river did not care. He looked at the cracked weld again. The reinforcing beam under it had taken on a subtle bow of its own, sharing too much of the burden for too long. One of the hastily added chains sang at a higher pitch now, stretched close to its limit. The bright edges of the separated metal at the original joint had dulled slightly with exposure to air and moisture, even in the short time since they had torn apart, as if the wound had started to scab. It was an illusion. The next heavy load would rip it open fresh. He understood, with the same cold clarity with which he had once watched a bus slide into water, that he had reached another of those moments where no choice was clean. If he halted operations now, if he declared the bridge unsafe for anything more than a single man crossing at a time, the battalion would survive the morning and bleed later for lack of the tools and supplies the trucks represented. If he pushed his luck one more time, if he allowed even one of those heavy vehicles onto a span that was already past design and past reason, the structure might hold, and they might keep enough equipment to keep men alive in future fights. Or it might fail in a way that would make Raich Bang look like a training accident. He watched the river slide by, brown and opaque, and for the first time that night, he felt something close to anger at the water itself. It had no memory, no conscience, no ledger. It did not distinguish between the weight of a civilian bus and a military truck, between people who had signed forms and people who had only ever signed paychits and letters home. It simply waited, patient and tireless, for the moment when gravity and human error tilted the equation in its favor. Behind him, someone asked if they should start bringing the trucks across again. Mitchell did not answer right away. He kept his eyes on the wounded joint, on the bright crack that had already taken them to the edge once. He listened to the bridge breathe under its lighter load now, trying to hear whether it had one more heavy exhale left in it or whether the next deep breath would be its last. He had promised Colonel Greer a bridge in 6 hours. He had not promised that the price would be measured only in sweat and sleep and skin. The war, the river, and the battered span in front of him were all waiting to see what he would wager next.